throw Tudwell to the piranhas in the dark web. But to do that, I needed the anonymity of the Tor browser. No one in their right mind would dare enter that scary place without a cover. At exactly 3 o'clock, the elevator door opened, and out stepped good-looking Richard Tudwell. He didn't see me. Why should he? I wasn't supposed to be there. He looked as smug and self-satisfied as any cat that ever ate canaries. I hated him. Fortunately for my sanity, his phone rang just as he started to cross the hall. He cheerfully answered it. There was a long pause while someone spoke. Then there was an expression of utter bewilderment on Turda, soon followed by an expression of utter horror. He argued for a few seconds, then he abruptly hung up. Turd ran to his car in a panic and sped back down White Sands Boulevard. Apparently his wife or boss had just looked over his little indiscretion. I was enjoying the beginning of the end of the overly titled Turd's life when the elevator jingled again and my wife stepped out of it. She looked both gorgeous and pensive. It was clear that she was troubled at heart. Lowering her eyes, she headed toward the back of the motel where her helicopter was parked. It was an adulterer's walk of shame. Then she felt the presence of someone in front of her. She stopped and lifted her head, irritation in her eyes. The look turned to one of incomprehension, and then it hit her. It's called vasovagal syncope. It's caused by shock. The more common term is fainting. At first, her eyes reflected pure amazement. Then they rolled back into her head. I picked her up and dragged her graceful little body to the nearest couch in the hall. The last thing I wanted to do was make a scene. Luckily, the guy behind the counter had disappeared. I sat her down there, still supporting her with my arm. She came to her senses almost instantly, looking confused, and then noticed who she was leaning on. Her sigh was loud enough to be heard by anyone in the hall. Luckily, there was no one there but us. I said as gently as I could, "I don't want you to explain anything. All I want to do is make the necessary final preparations." Brenda's face crumbled. She said in a voice full of grief, "Oh my God, Davy, this wasn't supposed to happen." I thought, "What did you think was going to happen, Sherlock?" But I replied, "You know the business I'm in." She grabbed me by the shoulders in a panic and said, "You have to let me explain. It's not what it looks like." I thought, they never seem to have fresh or original lines. I said, "It's exactly as it looks, my dear. Would you like a repeat?" I tapped the icon on my iPad and we both heard, "Oh yeah, that's it, harder!" Tears streamed down her face. She dropped her head in her hands and sobbed uncontrollably, repeating to herself, "You weren't supposed to know." The lobby was still at our disposal and I wanted to avoid a tantrum. So I pointed to the ladies' room and said, "Why don't you go in there and pull yourself together and we'll talk at home tonight? I have a long drive ahead of me." She nodded, misery written on her beautiful face. She said pitifully, "I love you, Davy, only you." I stood up, looked at her sitting on the couch, and said quite sincerely and honestly, "I love you too, Brenda. That's why this is so hard. It's getting late now. We'll talk at home." I turned on my heels and walked as calmly as I could toward the parking lot. The sounds of a woman crying rang in my ears. I was starting to feel wobbly myself. So I stopped at the first establishment that led north. I needed a drink. The waitress, who looked like an exhibit from a museum of tattoos and piercings, brought me a beer. Beer was a necessity. I began to feel the effects of the shock, nausea and chills. I realized that I needed to get back in the truck as soon as possible, or I wouldn't make it home. As I drove, I was happily contemplating the storm of shit I had unleashed on Tadwell. The look of absolute horror on his face was priceless, and the best part was that he hadn't seen anything yet. The real pain would come when Dark Web was done with him. Like I said, there are much better ways to get revenge than going to jail, like ruining that bastard's life. However, there was also the pathetic little bird, whose soul I had just crushed. I could see it in her eyes. She knew the price. It wasn't a matter of lost trust, or my ego. This is a simplistic view of cheating. The exclusive bond was severed, and all aspects of our special connection were gone. We will never be able to say, "It's just you and me, forever." The ghost of Richard Turd Tadwell will always stand between us and say, "But I was there too." We all have our weaknesses. Some lucky people manage to live their whole life without ever using them. However, more often than not, your personal weaknesses are your undoing. Worse, there is always collateral damage. For example, when the person you supposedly cherish most is dragged into the abyss with you. That was the reality the two of us were facing now. As for me, I was experiencing that empty feeling you get when you realize you're in the shit without a paddle. I had to take active steps to deal with Brenda's infidelity. But what should I do? Divorce her? Bury her in the backyard? Live like a cuckold? I don't like cuckolds or murderers, so door number 1 seemed to be the only viable option. We would have talked. But Brenda was a stranger to me now. I had no idea what could have motivated her to do such a hurtful thing. It was completely out of character for the woman I thought I knew. I assumed we shared a common vision for our future. Obviously, we didn't. There would be no more happy, intimate moments. No more enjoying the little things in life. No more growing old together. It would be an agonizing parting for both of us. We were just two strangers, alone in a strange land. It was already completely dark when I drove through the Mockingbird Mountains and into the desert area leading to State Road 525. On Sirius XM, the song When Someone Knows You So Well by Blake Shelton was playing. There was a sad irony in the lyrics. I drove through the bleak landscape of the Sonoran Desert. It was hard to believe that the future of mankind was being laid out in this barren wasteland. Our modern era began at 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945. It was at that moment that the proof of concept for a nuclear device blossomed on the desert sand in front of me. Its codename was Trinity. It was coined by Robert Oppenheimer, ostensibly as a reference to the poetry of John Donne. But American physicist Ken Bainbridge said it best. Now we're all sons of bitches. Splitting the atom has changed every aspect of human existence. The scientists who conducted it had no idea whether their little gadget would work or what would happen when they pressed the button, so they wanted to conduct the test as far away from civilization as possible. The U.S. Air Force Alamogordo bombing and gunnery range was the perfect place for it. It was in the middle of 100 miles of forbidding wasteland, full of nothing but lizards and snakes. There was only one structure within a 20-mile radius, and that was the bomb assembly building. When they finished, they hoisted their creation onto a 100-foot steel tower that stood on 4 supports 20 feet into the desert. The world then witnessed the dawn of the atomic age. The explosion turned sand into a new radioactive material called trinitite, and Oppenheimer, who was a bit of a bard, said, "I have now become death, the destroyer of worlds." I was approaching the driveway leading to the Trinity location. The landscape was decorated with the strange silvery light that a night sky with trillions of stars and a full moon gives off. The driveway was to my right, clearly visible. Headlights swept over the historical marker and a small figure appeared at the intersection, looking directly at me. It was the strangest, most startling vision imaginable. I hit the brakes and skidded to a stop. An alien-looking creature entered the cone of my headlights. It was a young woman of unearthly beauty, small but extremely graceful. I realized she was unusually slender because she was wearing a tight black jumpsuit that covered her from neck to boots. Her skin was a perfect alabaster color, and her lovely round face was elfin, with huge wide-set green eyes and short black hair. Think Tinkerbell in a cat costume. The suit had some sort of strange insignia on it over her surprisingly voluminous left breast, and on her right arm she wore a device similar to the monitors worn by U-2 pilots. I knew there were several out-of-state airfields in these parts, including Stallion AFB, which I was to pass by. So pardon me if I assumed it came out of a spy plane. I jumped out of the truck. She was standing on a pair of long, slender legs, one thigh off to the side, and looking at me puzzled. It was an odd reaction for someone who had just parachuted down from 65,000 feet. I asked worriedly, "Are you all right, ma'am? Can I take you somewhere where you can contact your people?" She said in a strangely melodic voice, "No, thank you. I just got my bearings. It's confusing in here." It was a strange reaction, like she was refusing to give him a ride home from work. I said, "There's nothing for miles around, ma'am. At least let me take you to a place where you can call. How did you get here?" She looked at me like I was an idiot and replied, "Through the portal, of course. Why?" Okay, things had gone from weird to crazy. I tried to keep my voice steady so as not to upset the crazy lady. "And where is this portal, ma'am?" She waved her hand vaguely toward the northeast and said, "Over there. It's a long walk, you know." She gestured toward the black obelisk marking ground 4 miles away. I said, still trying to make conversation. "Just to be clear, you came here through a portal that transported you from another place, yes, and where exactly is that other place?" She made a sound like a combination of a cough and a sigh and looked at me expectantly. Then she added, "I had to leave. It wasn't safe." So, to recap, This gorgeous little creature was fleeing from an unspecified problem that happened somewhere mysterious and ended up in the middle of the night in the Sonoran Desert. There was a shadow portal that she treated like a subway stop. Perhaps you can understand my bewilderment. Add to this my recent experience with marital infidelity, and you can probably imagine the level of stroke-inducing stress I was under. And yet, I couldn't just leave her there. I said, trying to sound reasonable. "It's not safe here either, ma'am. Why don't you get in the truck, and I'll take you to a place where you can get help." Whether that would be psychological help or just roadside assistance is debatable. She looked hesitant. I said, "Look, I'm not going to take you somewhere you don't want to go." I could see that was exactly what she was thinking. There was an ominous vibe coming from this woman in the form of a cosplay intergalactic refugee meme. I added, continuing to speak intelligently, "This area has been called the Death Trip since the 18th century. There's nothing here but snakes and predators, and you're not likely to survive long on your own." At that moment, a nearby coyote let out a dramatic howl. My little psycho shuddered and said pleadingly, "You won't hurt me?" I said. "Why do you think that?" Of course, only a few microns of mylar separated her from full nudity. And she did have the most exquisite body imaginable in Playboy or beyond. So I guess I could understand her concern. I added, "Look, I have my own problems. If you get in the truck, I'll tell you an entertaining story." My new friend may have just arrived from the cough-it-up planet, but she was clearly interested in what I had just said, and the coyote added a convincing amount of menace. So she hesitantly walked over to the passenger side of the 150, got in, and moved close to the door. We drove in silence for a while. Then she asked, "So?" I laughed and replied, "The events of my miserable life won't interest you. I just told you this so you would act sensibly. People die here, you know." She looked worried. She had such a perfectly proportioned face and such delicate features that with her warm alabaster skin, she looked like a porcelain angel. I asked sympathetically, "Where are your men? Where are you going? Who can I call?" She still looked distraught. Finally, she said pitifully, "I don't know anyone on this planet. It's just the place where the portal was set up when I jumped through the event horizon." "Okay, time to mess with the crazy woman." I kindly said, "So what made you jump? Why did you do it?" It must have been the first time she remembered the reason after what had happened. She looked at him with horror and said, "It was horrible. The growling hiccups were killing everyone. It was my only way out." I said, trying to make my voice sound reasonable, "So you were fleeing from something I can't pronounce. Who are they?" She said, "These are intergalactic predators, and my planet is their new feeding ground. I was lucky enough to be on shift in the transporter center when they showed up." From her tone, it felt like everyone knew about the growls and hiccups. Then she stopped and seemed to be thinking about something. She added encouragingly, "Don't worry, I closed the portal when I jumped. They won't be able to come here now." At least this conversation was more interesting than country music, I said. "Okay, let's assume you are who you say you are. Then why do you look like a human being, and why can we communicate in English except for a few words?" She cheerfully replied, "English? Is that the name of your language?" Then she added, "I speak directly into your mind. But some of the things we are discussing have no concepts that can be translated." So, my little geek claimed to be a telepath. She continued, "All life forms of our type evolved from the same basic structure. It is nature's most efficient structure, so of course we are similar." I laughed and said, "You have an answer for everything, don't you?" She smiled sweetly and asked, "So why are you so sad?" It shocked me. I asked, "How do you know I'm sad?" "It must have been my body language," she added, her voice full of innocent curiosity. "Is it because your friend was just divorced by another male?" I hit the brakes, stopping the truck right in the middle of the road, and stared at her in horror. I asked anxiously, "How do you know this? Who are you?" She said, "My name is Stella, and as I said, I come from Kashi in the Perseus arm of our galaxy. Your sun is in the outer arm, so we're practically neighbors." She smiled flirtatiously at me, then sat up and looked at me as if she had just made a joke. Don't bother telling me. Of course, I knew she was delusional. But to play a joke on her, I said, "If you're from an advanced alien race, why are you here in the middle of the howling desert? One would think your ancestors would have set up an arrival point, somewhere more convenient and civilized." She said, as if lecturing a child, Builders install a portal the moment they discover irrefutable evidence that a culture has advanced enough to merit study. I said, so the explosion of the first atomic bomb was like a signal flare for your people. Gah! Now I was starting to sound like her. She nodded and replied, yes, there are billions of civilizations in our galaxy, but only the advanced ones are of interest. She said it as if everyone should know that. The crazy lady continued, the builders actually prefer a remote access point. It allows them to come and go in secret. We have been scouting your planet for over 70 years. We even lost one of our first expeditions not far from here. She must have meant Roswell. The woman was clearly suffering from some form of psychosis. Seriously! She actually thought she was an alien. So I couldn't just drop her off at the Albuquerque bus station. After all, it would be wrong to abandon such a crazy woman. The problem was that I was rushing home to negotiate the end of my marriage, and I knew the conversation would be heated if I showed up with that delicious morsel in tow. It would be like pouring a gallon of gasoline on a raging fire. So, no pressure. Stella said sympathetically, you can just leave me alone if I'm in the way of you meeting your buddy. I didn't hit the brakes. I was used to her reading my facial expressions, like she was reading my mind. Still, I knew I was ready. My new friend was clearly a decent man. I said, I don't know your story, but I can't just throw you away. I have to help you. A beauty like hers wouldn't last 2 minutes on the dirty streets of Albuquerque. I said, I don't know how you know that, but you're right. I just saw my wife with another man, and in my culture that is the most glaring form of betrayal. Now I'm coming home to discuss the terms of our separation. Culture? I had to watch myself, or she'd drag me into her delusion. Stargirl Stella was very convincing. She nodded and said, yes, that's how it is in most family cultures. It guarantees the origin of the offspring. In my world it doesn't matter, since all children are raised by the central dwarf. I assumed that was her untranslatable word for government. She added sincerely, of course couples can choose to have an exclusive union. It's very romantic. But the grunting that is implanted during the ceremony kills them if they engage in extramarital relations after being tied up. Grunting was obviously a technology. Maybe we should get one of those too. It would certainly make couples take fidelity more seriously. I smiled at the thought and said, we haven't gotten to that point yet. But our technology is good enough that you can always tell if a person has lost their way. That's how I caught my wife. And the guy who seduced her will definitely wish he was dead when I'm done ruining his life. Stella replied, reflecting, I've never had any desire to commit myself. It's too much fun to be limited to just one man. On the other hand, I sometimes wonder what it would be like to be so devoted to a man. I said, it's beautiful and scary. The intimacy that two people share far outweighs the lack of diversity in partners. Brenda and I made up for any limitations we experienced with the exceptional frequency and quality of it. The exclusivity of our connection made it that much more meaningful. Shit, I forgot. Our exclusivity was now a thing of the past. I tried to remain calm. After all, I was talking to a crazy person, but I couldn't drown out the ranting in my head. It was the same archetypal duality that infidelity breeds. I loved Brenda and hated her, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that killing Tadwell wasn't such a bad idea. Stella said soothingly, killing another male is not the answer. You've already made it much worse for him by making him look like a predator. You need to talk to your friend and find out why she did it. Not knowing will prevent you from moving on. Stella said soothingly, killing another male is not the answer. You've already made it much worse for him by making him look like a predator. You need to talk to your friend and find out why she did it. Not knowing will prevent you from moving on. Audience, the third chapter of our gripping story confirms the wise saying that truth is sometimes stranger than fiction. We followed Dave on his journey through a valley of doubt and resentment to the moment he learns of Brenda's betrayal, a moment that became a boiling point for their relationship. A vaguely curly-haired figure, seemingly from outer space and drawn into this earthly drama, brings a completely unexpected twist to our narrative. This encounter forces Dave to reflect not only on his own emotions, but also on the essence of human relationships in general. Like an extraterrestrial oracle, Stella offers an alternative perspective on loyalty, faithfulness, and acceptance. Despite this fantastic encounter, however, the rift between Dave and Brenda becomes increasingly palpable, emphasized by their subsequent conversation, filled with despair and the bitterness of betrayal. The meeting with Stella gives Dave a moment of reflection, leaving us, the audience, to ask, what is the foundation of a real relationship? Emotional intimacy and trust, or more practical, earthly ties? How will Dave and Brenda handle this challenge? Will Dave be able to forgive Brenda? And is there any chance of repairing their bond? We'll find out in the upcoming chapter. For those who want to dive into the full uncensored version and feel the full extent of our characters' experiences, we remind you that the full version is available on our Patreon. Join us as we continue this thrilling flight through the universe of human emotions and relationships and find out what other surprises await our heroes.